Welcome to USSO's Eyes on Events.
Hello and welcome to Eyes on Events. Today I'm defying jet lag with a unique episode of Eyes on Events, the first of an equally unique series for this academic year dedicated to outreach initiatives, particularly those involving teaching. Today I'm delighted to be sitting here over Zoom with Sam Thoburn, a PhD candidate at the University of Manchester and USSO's very own outreach editor. Sam, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thanks. Glad to be here, Tom.
Today, Sam and I will be talking to Andrew Fearnley, a historian of race in the United States, also based at Manchester. We'll be talking to Andrew about his recent project investigating how the 20th century civil rights movement is taught in A-level courses here in the UK. This initiative, funded by the US Embassy, BASS and the University of Manchester's Social Responsibility Funds, produced the pamphlet New Approaches to US Civil Rights History, which will be linked in our publicity for this episode, and which we'll base most of our questions on today.
Andrew, welcome to USSO. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on the channel.
Absolutely our pleasure. So to start us off, for those of us, myself included, whose A-level days may be long behind us, could you just provide the broad picture, the bare bones of how the civil rights movement is currently taught in schools and how and why you chose to intervene on the teaching of this particular topic?
Sure, great place to start. So US civil rights history features on all the major exam boards, and there's some evidence that the topic is being studied by the majority of 50,000 or so students who take history at A-level. It's second only to the Russian Revolution, according to a fairly recent study. So there's really widespread interest in the topic amongst teachers and students, and I think that's only grown in recent years, given the resurgence and the salience of movements for racial justice, both in the United States and in the UK. Now, most of the modules that are taught around civil rights or race relations in the United States tend to be organized around both what are called breadth and depth studies. And so inevitably, many of them cover quite a wide span of time. For example, one runs from the end of the Civil War, start of Reconstruction in 1865, through to the Los Angeles riots. And that's fairly typical. It's fairly popular as well. And this attention to the kind of longue durée of the Black freedom struggle is well-intentioned, but it's not always well formulated. So one module, for example, which is entitled Civil Rights and Race Relations, runs from 1850 to 2009, and it's very uneven in its coverage, and this isn't atypical. So the subject guide for that particular module tells teachers what to cover, and the teachers that we surveyed as part of this project, most of them based in the Greater Manchester and the Northwest region, told us, and I quote, understandably, that their students struggle with the immediate Second World War period. And when we looked at this, the subject spec basically stops in 1941 and then takes up the story again with the Brown decision in 1954. So there's this kind of, gaping hole. And from the perspective of, the last 10, 15 years of academic scholarship, this has been a vibrant area. One thinks of studies by Glenda Gilmore and Pat Sullivan and Danielle McGuire, as well as the edited collection by Steve Tuck and Kevin Cruz. And there are many instances where there are kind of, gaping holes in the coverage of A-level history, civil rights modules. So there's a tendency also to neaten and to kind of flatten out the material that is covered, often associating particular figures as kind of brand representatives of certain political ideologies or political philosophies. edXL's main civil rights component, for example, is entitled I Have a Dream. And these decisions really matter. One teacher told us that many students are left, having studied this, with the tendency of thinking that Martin Luther King is the civil rights struggle, that's the kind of start and end point of the module. Now, I think all of this happens for a few reasons. They're all very interesting. One is the long imprint that political science has had on the teaching of secondary history, I think, in the UK. So as I've already said, there's a real attention to the institutions of state, a real kind of preoccupation with asking about the relationship between the presidency, in particular presidents, and major figures of civil rights or Black activism. And also, as I've said, this tendency of associating particular figureheads with certain approaches to civil rights. More generally, if we just kind of back up and expand, there are obvious weaknesses all over, particularly the curriculum and the specifications. The subject tends to be set in strict isolation, so it has really very little to say about, this moment of post-war insurgency in the way that Adam Guttichew's work, World Making After Empire, has, really brilliantly captured for many of us in the last few years. It's removed from the new projects of racial management that are going on in like apartheid South Africa. As several sources, like including the Royal Historical Society has recently shown, it also tends to be studied in the absence of Black British history as well. None of the boards seem to know what to do with Black Power. It remains at best focused on the Black Panther Party, and very narrowly so, and it continues to be seen through the kind of really heightened gendered lens of the period. And there's very little attention to segregation outside the US South. So there's no real engagement with the work of, Tom Segru and many others who are associated with the kind of Freedom North studies of the last 20 years or so. And this creates huge problems. Nobody really knows what to do with what are still called the race riots of the 1960s, those urban rebellions that, engulf America's cities from the mid-60s on, and that Peter Levy has very imaginatively encouraged us to think of as the Great Uprising. That remains a huge problem, I think. So you asked what was my route into this. It came really, I think, along two trajectories. The first was as someone who obviously teaches and researches and writes about this in a university, and I was just generally curious to try to take stock of what's been going on in scholarship around the Black Freedom movement over the last 15 years or so, really since the publication of Jackie Hall's essay in 2005 on the long civil rights movement and the political uses of the past. And my second route into this was as somebody who'd done many school talks and had served as the admissions tutor for American Studies at Manchester, and had been invited into schools. And, I could see the depth and seriousness of interest amongst teachers and students, and equally just how kind of outdated some of the questions and materials serviced in this area were. So that's where the booklet came from.
Great, thank you. That's a very expansive answer, and that kind of segues perfectly into a lot of the secondary questions that we had today to do with this topic. I mean, you talked a lot and you cited a lot of scholarship there, which has come out particularly since this model of the long civil rights movements of the mid even 2000s. Lots of scholarship there, which is shedding new angles, shedding more expansive and more transnational picture of the civil rights movement. This may be quite a difficult question to understand, but the paper and the project essentially kind of situate itself around this juxtaposition of what is called a remarkable renaissance in this recent scholarship, and yet a public understanding and a way of teaching that you say is, quote, stubbornly unchanging. Particularly that American national memory of the civil rights movement largely continues to enlist the movement's history as evidence of the country's democratic traditions. Why has the civil rights movement, particularly in this political moment, particularly after, events like Black Lives Matter, which we've seen, particularly in the last half decade or so, why has this understanding proven so persistent, particularly within the frame of secondary education?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an important question, I think, for all kind of historians of the American civil rights movement in practicing in the United Kingdom to really think about, actually, in their kind of wider engagement. Comer Van Woodward, the great US Southern historian, said in the 1980s that worthy causes are believed to deserve worthy histories. And I think the history of the American civil rights movement is indicative, emblematic of this particular fact, that, as Woodward well knew, it's never just historians who are writing about the past. And in the case of US civil rights movement, there are obviously many actors and hands that are also helping to shape the popular understanding here. And the general public, the media, and also institutions of state increasingly in the US have kind of co-opted and drawn up this narrative that is, as you say, celebratory and kind of redemptive of the institutions of American democracy. It's important probably to recognize that, American civil rights history isn't a singular case in having this divergence between academic and popular histories. One only thinks of recent debates, for example, around the American Revolution or slavery in the Constitution. And also it's important probably just to say that I'm by no means the first to kind of point this out. You know, it's got a long history. Brian Ward was writing about it in the early 2000s in the introduction to media culture and the African American freedom struggle, this kind of the stubbornness of this popular narrative. So one of the sources that we took as our kind of touchstone of the project, as I've already mentioned, was this essay by Jackie Dowd Hall, published a long time ago now. I remember discussing it at graduate school. And it was published in 2005. And it's a brilliant piece. It gave us a novel framework, as you've said already, Tom, for thinking about civil rights in this fresh way, as this kind of long movement that emerges out of the context of the labor activism of the 30s. But usefully, and perhaps also what gets missed in kind of recent recoveries of Hall's essay, is it also gave us a diagnosis of some of where this popular narrative came from and why it became so ingrained and entrenched in America and in American politics and popular culture. And for Hall, that was the institutions of the new right. It was captured by the Republican Party in the 1980s and by kind of allied think tanks and sibling organizations in the US media. And then it was kind of embedded in the kind of American national memory, as it were. And our project took Hall's 2005 essay as its starting point, and we wanted to kind of track what had happened in the academy over the last 15 years, what effect has Hall's essay had in general. But we also wanted to try to push this latter diagnosis of, it's really the new right that has bossed this kind of popular narrative. And I think, Hall's essay is brilliant, but one of its limitations is it doesn't really offer a kind of, to my mind at least, a kind of persuasive solution for how you might go about correcting this popular narrative and the kind of divergence with, the renaissance of academic scholarship on civil rights. This is also the case, I think, in the United Kingdom. We've absorbed a very particular understanding, both in the popular realm and in secondary teaching, of what the American Civil Rights Movement was, what it meant, how it worked, and so forth. That's often, as I've said, neatened and flattened. That's been absorbed from a variety of channels. It's been absorbed from journalism, from popular commentary. The Civil Rights Movement is often a touchstone of contemporary British politics, for example. It's kind of a lazy metaphor that's deployed by politicians of all stripes in this country. So I began this project with a sense that we needed to find a way of translating the very good, fine scholarship that's been going on over the past 15 years and pumping it into schools. And here we kind of touch on a major perennial question of American historians, which is writing for popular audiences. And, this is a kind of preoccupation of American historians, particularly in the United States. And there are often these kind of lamentations for the days of Dick Hofstadter writing for his kind of, middlebrow audience and so on. And I agree broadly with Tom Segru, who recently wrote that, it's kind of been a veritable golden age of scholars in the United States and elsewhere writing for popular audiences. But what I think gets missed in that debate is that when we write for the New York Times or the Washington Post Made by History project, we're not specifically writing for schools and educators and teachers. We're writing for a middlebrow audience of readers, and not all of them are teachers. And even if they are, we're not presenting and packaging what we're writing in forms that are immediately digestible and relevant to the classroom. And so I think this is very important. This is what the project tried to do, to understand what's gone on over the last 15 years in civil rights scholarship quite broadly, and then crucially to translate it and to package it in a way that would be digestible and relevant to what is being taught in British secondary schools, particularly at A level.
Thank you so much for that wonderful answer. Listening to you speak, I was reminded of a lecture I was in with you in first year when you took the class to task for not remembering the name of A. Philip Randolph in reference to the 1943 March on Washington and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which came to mind when you were talking about changing the narrative around the sort of canonical icons of the civil rights movement. when it comes to somebody as iconic as Martin Luther King, obviously a lot of scholarship, I think, of Bearing the Cross, even the enormous biography by David Garrow, talking about his sort of underexplored misogyny, his views on women. How do you go about changing the narrative or complicating the narrative on somebody so iconic, but perhaps flattened as a figure as Martin Luther King, or indeed an event like the March on Washington?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an important question because, as we've already referenced, King is at the center of current A-level history specifications around civil rights. So it's a really important question for us to think about and for teachers as well. It's not an easy question, right? I think there are a number of components to a response to reframing King, not as this kind of emblematic figure of all that is civil rights, but as one major component within a much broader machinery. So I think, as you just kind of referenced there, Sam, I think the first thing is to recognize that most of the students at A level and even before already have some assumptions of who King is and what he stood for. My daughter, who's in primary school, doesn't know necessarily who King is from me, but she knows, or she might know, who he is because of the quotations that are kind of embroidered into the fabric of her school, one of which is by Martin Luther King and others by Nelson Mandela and so forth. So I think that's our first duty, actually, to survey what our students know about King or the other major historical figures that we're working with. I think one element that teachers have kind of emphasized to me over the past few years is a need not for kind of new accounts of such figures, but actually for a better and closer engagement on the part of academics when they're working with schools of primary sources. We need to go back and actually read what King wrote and more often what he said. And I think this is really important work. The number of students who can quote lines from King's most famous speech on the Washington Mall in August 63, who haven't actually read that speech from start to finish is just astounding. So that would be the first task, actually, to go back. And here I'm thinking perhaps of, I don't know if you're familiar with David Blight's American Oracle, short book on the kind of Civil War memory amidst the Civil Rights Revolution. But the opening 5-10 pages of that typically brilliant book by Blight is a close reading, a close textual reading of King's speech. And it's so fresh because he's working with the words that King actually uttered. And what Blight shows is, I suppose, the secondary or even the tertiary importance of the dream metaphor that, as Blight shows us, really comes very late and is really marginal to the kind of tenor of that speech. And instead, he gives us these very, persuasive alternative readings that actually frame King's speech in 63, of course, amidst the century of the nation's broken promise to African Americans, the Reconstruction era promises of 1863. So I think, primary sources with really well-worked recontextualizations of who King is. Some of the scholarship that we touched on that my students wrote about in this booklet project also drew on other biographies, particularly biographies of Black women, which also made an important and kind of innovative step in repositioning how we use the biography. So I'm thinking here of Barbara Ransby's, magisterial biography of Ella Baker, where one of the features of that work is to bring out what Ransby calls the networks of contacts, the sisterly supports. And these are concepts that have been reworked by subsequent scholars more recently. So positioning King, whether it be in the Montgomery Association or within the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as a figure amongst, a number of others. And then finally, I would just say fresh reframings of him in the context of his work outside of the United States. So I'm thinking of Brian Ward's work on King's time in Newcastle, or Stephen Tuck's work on Malcolm X in Oxford and other parts of the United Kingdom. These have, I think, framed, particularly for a British or non-American audience, those canonical figures in new light. And I think thinking how we can transport that effectively to secondary educators is some of the work that we can now do.
That's great, thank you. And it did bring to mind myself having done an A-level about half a decade ago, just how segmented off a lot of the primary source material sort of is, particularly in an age when we have videos and visual content more freely available than elsewhere. A lot of the time this is kind of in sources and source treatment methodology kind of papers, and that kind of divorces those two contexts. So it's interesting to think about. Coming to the end and kind of thinking more about the structural issues as we're running out of time here. We talked a lot about the theory, about the historiography, but what I also wanted to ask is, given this juxtaposition of new historiography and over-capacious, unadaptable secondary high school courses, is what was your experience of dialoguing with all the many secondary school teachers who you referenced, who you talked to in this report, and what kind of do you find are the structural issues in that relationship which impede that communication, and what changes could improve it going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question again. So this was a lockdown project. We completed this in the fall of 2020. So actually the 13 students who contributed to the project, I didn't actually meet for another 6 months or so. The booklet was out in the world before then. As you say, one component of the project was to work closely with teachers. I was very conscious at the outset. I mean, if you just think of the summer of 2020, the first kind of A-level crisis, I don't know if you were caught up in that. I don't think you were, but it was a moment when schools were beleaguered by kind of indifferent Secretary of Education, of which we've had many. And so I really didn't want to create a resource that was kind of preaching to teachers or that was trying to foist a certain approach on them. So from the outset, we set up an advisory group of around 10 teachers across the kind of professional spectrum, from those who've been in education for 20 years and those who had just started on the job. And my students surveyed them. We read subject specs to get a sense, and then we asked them, well, what would be most useful to you? What kind of resource are you looking for? What are the areas, as I've already mentioned, that your students, don't quite understand or that you need help with? And so out of that, we got a real sense of direction and purpose for the scholarship that we were going to actually present in the booklet. And this was all informed by what in the States is often called kind of action research. My wife's a health researcher, and this is very big in that field. And the idea of creating something that's genuinely collaborative and the involvement of teachers throughout was very important. So the shape of the booklet reflects that. And what I would say to members listening and interested in working with schools and educators more broadly is to meet teachers, obviously, when you're giving school talks, to ask them practically what kinds of materials they require, they need, what kinds of talks they want. Often when you're invited, the invite is, can you give a talk on a particular topic? And so it's useful to, I think, to go back and say, what would be most useful to you and to your students. In terms of the structure, I think I would give a plug, the kind of structural issues here. I'd give a plug to the discipline and the field of American studies in this country in really pushing public humanities work. I'm obviously at Manchester, and I did this project, and several of my colleagues there have done similar types of projects, not so much with schools, but with community groups. One colleague has helped to create an archival collection documenting hip hop, and that's deposited at a local public library. And colleagues at UEA, which have been real trailblazers, I think, in this area, working with their own students and wider audiences to republish, for example, 19th century children's novels that had fallen out of print, and to produce a critical edition of such. So in terms of the structure, and I think this is where organizations like USSO and BAS and HOTCUS and many others can kind of lead the way. Creating conversations with these wider publics, I think, is important as the first step to kind of survey them, to understand what it is they might need or want from us. And then to work with them to constantly kind of, show at the drafting stage, the editing stage, the materials that we're producing. And I'm in the process right now of thinking about the wider dissemination of this project and the most effective way of kind of doing that work.
So to that point, Andrew, what's next for this network that you've been able to build? What's happening next? What can we get involved with?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm on the exec of BAS, the British Association of American Studies, and we've got a new teachers network that's launching hopefully in the early part of 23. We've done the preparatory work for that already, but you'll be seeing notices going out. So if you're a PhD student, if you're a master's student, you're interested in a career in secondary education, or you're interested in working with schools in one shape or form to disseminate your own research, then look out for that and get in touch, because there will be opportunities, and I hope also opportunities that will work closely with yourselves at USSO around. We're going to be thinking about the production of resources, for example, for classrooms, and a colleague on the BAS exec is already spearheading a project around precisely that. And we're also going to be thinking about working with other audiences and publics in 2023 as well, beyond the kind of secondary education, but to the wider British public around these major topics. And I hope there might be another booklet project in future as well.
Thank you very much. I think everyone involved in American studies at this particular moment, or indeed familiar with America, probably knows what that change of mind feels like, and probably knows it all too well. Thank you very much, Andrew, for that and all the other expansive answers you've given us today. It'll really be interesting to see as UK schools return to some form of long-term planning with the return to post-COVID normality, how events like Donald Trump's election, maybe re-election, and the Black Lives Matter movement will influence this curriculum. Nonetheless, we have to say, watch this space, and please do watch this space via USSO as we embark on these kind of conversations about teaching and academia and curricula, which are so important in the world today. So thank you, Sam and Andrew, for both lending your respective expertise to the topic of discussion today. That's the end of USSO's Eyes on Events, a very long one, but I think entirely justified given the importance of what was under discussion. Thank you very much for listening.